The parish authorities resolved that Oliver should be farmed, or in other words, that he should be dispatched to a branch workhouse some 3 miles off, where 20 or 30 other juvenile offenders against the poor laws rode against the floor all day, without the inconvenience of too much food or too much clothing, under the parental superintendence of an elderly female who received the culprits at and for the consideration of 7 pence halfpenny per week, is a good round diet for a child. A great deal may be got for 7 pence halfpenny, quite enough to overload its stomach and make it uncomfortable. The elderly female was a woman of wisdom and experience. She knew of what was good for herself. So she appropriated the greater part of the weekly stipend to her own use, and consigned the rising screw that part, to even a shorter allowance than was originally provided for them. Unfortunately, at the very moment when the child had contrived to exist upon the smallest possible portion of the weakest possible food, it did sorry. Occasionally, when there was some more than usually interesting inquest upon a parish child, the jury would take it into their heads to ask troublesome questions, or would rebelliously affix their signatures to a remonstrance. Why is there so many complicated words? The evidence of the surgeon and the testimony of the beadle, the former of whom had always opened the body and found nothing inside, which was very probable indeed, and the latter of whom invariably swore whatever the parish wanted, which was very self-devotional. Besides, the board made periodical pilgrimages to the farm, and always sent the beadle the day before, to say they were going. The children were neat and clean to behold when they went, and what more would the people have? It couldn't be expected that this system of farming would produce any very extraordinary or luxuriant crop. Oliver's Twist's 9th birthday found him a pale, thin child, somewhat diminutive in stature, and decidedly small in circumference. He was keeping it in the coal cellar with a select party of 2 other young gentlemen, who, after participating with him in a sound thrashing, had been locked up therein for atrociously presuming to be hungry, when Mrs. Mann... this part's kind of boring. Goodness gracious, is that you, Mr. Bumble, sir? Said Mrs. Mann, thrusting her head out of the window in well-affected ecstasies of joy. Susan, take Oliver and them 2 brat upstairs, and wash them directly. My heart alive! Mr. Bumble, how glad I am to see you surely. Now, Mr. Bumble was a fat bloke, and about to die soon, because he had high cholesterol. Instead of responding to this open-hearted salutation in a kindred spirit, he gave the little wicked a tremendous shake, and then punched the crud out of him. Law, only think, said Mrs. Mann, running out, for the 3 boys had been removed by the time. Only think of that. Then I should have forgotten that the gate was bolted on in the inside, on account of them, dear children. Walk in, sir, walk in, pray, Mr. Bumble, do, sir. Although this invitation was accompanied with a curtsy that might have softened the heart of a churchwarden, it by no means modified the beadle. That's a beadle. Do you think this is respectful or proper conduct, Mrs. Mann? Inquired Mr. Bumble, gripping his cane. To keep the parish officers waiting at your garden gate when they come here upon parochial business connected with the parochial orphans? Are you aware, Mrs. Mann, that you are, as I may say, a parochial delegate and a stipendiary? I'm sure, Mr. Bumble, with your strange voice, that I was only a-telling 1 or 2 of the dear children as is so fond of you, that it was you a-coming, replied Mrs. Mann with great lies. Mr. Bumble had a great idea of his powers and his importance, he had displayed the one and vindicated the other. He relaxed. Well, Mrs. Man, he replied in a calmer tone. It may be as you say, it may be. Lead the way in, Mrs. Man, for I come on business, and I've got something to say. Mrs. Munn ushered the beadle into a small parlour with a brick floor, placed a seat for him, and officiously deposited his cocked hat and cane on the table before him. Mr. Bumble wiped from his forehead the perspiration because he's fat. Which his walk had engendered. I'm sorry, fat people. Gazed complacently at the cocked hat and smiled. Yes, he smiled. Beetles are but men. And Mr. Bumble smiled because he was a man. Uh-oh, sexism. Now don't you be offended at what I'm going to say, observed Mrs. Mann with captivating Oh, shoot, that's Mrs. Mann. You've had a long walk, or I would have mentioned it. Now, will you take a little drop of something, Mr. Bumble? Not a drop, said Mr. Bumble, waving his right hand in a dignified but still placid manner. I think you will, said Mrs. Mann, who had noticed the tone of the refusal and the gesture that accompanied it. Just a little drop, with a little cold water and a lump of sugar. Mr. Bumble coughed. Now just a little drop, said Mrs. Mann persuasively. What is it? Inquired the beadle. Why, it's what I'm What is it? Inquired the beadle. Why, it's what I'm obliged to keep in a little of in the house, to put into the blessed infant's medicine. Wait, what is this? Drugs? Now where was I? Why, it's just drugs when they ain't well, Mr. Bumble, replied Mrs. Mann as she opened a corner cupboard and took down a bottle and glass. It's cocaine. Now, not deceive you, Mr. B. It's cocaine. Do you give the children medicine, Mrs. Mann? Inquired Bumble, following with his eyes the interesting process of mixing. Ah, bless him, that I do, dear it is, replied the nurse. I couldn't see them suffer before my very eyes, sir, as I lied. No, you said Mr. Bumble approvingly. No, you could not. You are a humane woman, Mrs. Mann. Here she set down the glass. I shall take an early opportunity of mentioning it to the board, Mrs. Mann. He drew it towards him. You feel as a mother, Mrs. Mann. He stirred the gin and water. Oh yeah, it's not cocaine, it's gin. Sorry guys. I drink your health with cheerfulness, Mrs. Mann. And he swallowed all of it. And now about business, said the beadle, taking out a leathern pocket-book. The child that was half baptized, Oliver Twist, is 9-year-old today. Bless him, interposed Mrs. Mann, inflaming her left eye with the corner of her apron. And notwithstanding of an offered reward of £10, which was afterwards increased to £20, notwithstanding the most superlative, and I must say supernatural exertions on the part of this parish, said Bumble, he has never been able to discover who is his father, or what was his mother's settlement name or condition. In other words, he's an orphan. Wait, actually that should be obvious by now. Continue. Carrying on. Mrs. Mann raised her hand in astonishment, but added after a moment's reflection, how come he has a name? That's true. Why does he have a name? The beadle drew himself up with great pride and said, I invented it. Fun fact, it's spelled with a W here. Invented it. I invented it. You, Mr. Bumble? I, Mrs. Mann. We name our fondlings in alphabetical order. The last was a S. Swamble. Oh God, terrible name. Swamble. I named him. This was a T. Twist. I named him. The next ones as comes will be unwin. And the next, Vilkins. Oh my god, this Mr. Bumble sucks at naming, guys. And all the way through it again when we come to Z. Xylophone. Why, you're quite a literary character, sir, said Mrs. Munn. Well, well, said the beadle, evidently gratified with the compliment. Perhaps I may be sucking at English. Mrs. Mann, he finished the gin and water and added, Oliver being now too old to remain here, the board have decided to have him back into the house, and I have come out myself to take him there. So let me see him at once. I'll fetch him directly, said Mrs. Mann, leaving the room for that purpose, and Oliver, having had by this time as much of the outer coat of dirt which encrusted his face and hands removed as could be scrubbed off in one washing, was led into the room by his benevolent protectress. Olden English. Make a bow to the gentleman, Oliver, said Mrs. Mann. Oliver made a bow before falling down, which was divided between the beadle and on the chair and the cocked hat on the table. Will you go along with me, Oliver? Said Mr. Bumble in a majestic voice. Oliver was about to say that he would go along with anybody with great readiness when, glancing upward, he caught sight of Mrs. Mann, who had got behind the beadle's chair and was shaking her fist at him with a furious countenance. He took the hint at once, for the fist had been too often impressed upon his body. Oh, goodness, this is child abuse. Will she go with me? Inquired poor Oliver. No, she can't, replied Mr. Bumble, but she'll come and see you sometimes. This was not very good consolation to the child, no shit, because he got child abused. But young as he was, he had sense enough to make a feint of feeling great regret at going away. It was no very difficult matter for the boy to call tears into his eyes. Hunger and recent ill usage are very great assistants if you want to cry, and Oliver cried very naturally indeed. Mrs. Mann gave him 1,000 embraces, and what Oliver wanted a great deal more, a piece of butter and bread, lest he should seem too hungry when he got to the workhouse. With the slice of bread in his hand and the little brown cloth parish cap on his head, Oliver was then led away by Mr. Bumble from the wretched home where one kind word or look had never lightened the gloom of his infant years. And yet he burst into an agony of childish grief as the cottage gate closed after him. Wretched as were the little companions in misery he was leaving behind, they were the only friends he had ever known, and the sense of his loneliness in the great wide world sank into the child's heart for the first time. Mr. Bumble walked on with long strides, and little Oliver, firmly grasping his gold-laced cuff, trotted beside him, inquiring at the end of every quarter of a mile whether they were nearly there. Are we there yet? To these interrogations, Mr. Bumble returned very brief and snappish replies, for the temporary blandness which gin and water awakens in some bosoms had by this time evaporated, and he was once again a beadle. Oliver had not been within the walls of the workhouse a quarter of an hour, and had scarcely completed the demolition of a second slice of bread, when Mr. Bumble, who had handed him over to the care of an old woman, returned, and telling him it was a board night, informing him that the board had said he was going to appear before it forthwith. I screwed that up. Not having a very clearly defined notion of what a life board is, Oliver was rather astounded by this intelligence and was not quite certain whether he ought to laugh or cry. He had no time to think about the matter, however, for Mr. Bumble gave him a tap on the head with his cane to wake him up, and another on the back to make him into a large whitewashed room where 8 or 10 fat gentlemen were sitting round on a table, at the top of which, seated in an armchair rather higher than the rest, was a particularly fat gentleman with a very round face. Bow to the board, said Bumble. Oliver brushed away 2 or 3 tears that were lingering in his eyes, and seeing no board but the table, fortunately bowed to that. What's your name, boy? Said the gentleman in the high chair. Oliver was frightened at the sight of so many gentlemen, which made him tremble, and the beadle gave him another tap behind. And these two causes made him answer in a very low and hesitating voice, whereupon a gentleman in a white waistcoat said he was a fool, which was a capital way of raising his spirits, and putting him quite at ease.
Boy,
Said the gentleman in the high chair,
listen to me. You know you're an orphan, I suppose.
What's that, sir? Inquired poor Oliver.
The boy is a fool. I thought he was,
Said the gentleman in a white coat, in a very decided tone. If one member of a class be blessed with intuitive perception of others of the same race, aka racism, or something like that, the gentleman in the white waistcoat was unquestionably well qualified to be a to pronounce an opinion of the matter.
Hush, said the gentleman who had spoken first. You've known you got no father or mother, and that you were brought up by the parish, don't you?
Yes, sir, replied Oliver, weeping bitterly.
What are you crying for? Inquired the gentleman in the white waistcoat. And to be sure he was very extraordinary. What could the boy be crying for? I hear you say your prayers every night,
Said another gentleman in a gruff voice.
and pray for the people who feed you and take care of you, like a Christian.
That's part of the book, I swear, okay? No. Yes, sir, stammered the boy. The gentleman who spoke last was unconsciously right. He would have been very like a Christian, and a marvelously good Christian too. And other religions, of course. If Oliver had prayed for the people who fed and took care of him. But he hadn't, because nobody had taught him.
Well, you have come here to be educated and taught a useful trade,
Said the red-faced gentleman in the high chair. So you'll begin to pick oakum tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, added the surly one in the white waistcoat. Oh, my bad. Poor Oliver, he little thought, as he lay sleeping in happy unconsciousness of all around him, that the Bond had the very day arrived at a decision which would exercise the most material influence over his future fortunes. But it had, and this was it. The members of this board were very sage, deep, philosophical men, and when they came to turn their attention to the workhouse, they found out at once what ordinary folks would have never discovered. The poor people liked it. It was a regular place of public entertainment for the poorer classes, a tavern where there were nothing to pay, a public breakfast, dinner, tea, and supper, and all the year round. A brick and mortar Elysium, where it was all play and no work. Oh ho, said the boy, looking very knowing.
we are the fellows to set this to the right. We'll stop it in no time, because we hate poor people.
So they established a rule that all poor people should have the alternative, for they would compel nobody, not they, of being starved, but by a gradual process in the house, or by quick work, one out of it. With this view, they contracted with the waterworks to lay out an unlimited supply of water, and a corn factor to supply periodically small quantities of oatmeal, and issued 3 meals of thin gruel a day, with an onion twice a week, and half a roll on Sundays. They made a great many otherwise and humane regulations, which is not necessary to repeat. Wait, hold on, wait, what? Okay, just saying I don't understand thus far. For the first 6 months after Oliver Twist was removed, the system was in full operation. It was rather expensive at first, in consequence of the increase in the undertaker's bill and the necessity of taking in the clothes of all the paupers, which fluttered loosely on their wasted, shrunken forms after a week or two's gruel. But the number of workhouse inmates got thin as well as the paupers, and the board were in ecstasies. The room in which the boys were fed was a large stone hall with a copper at one end, out of which the master, dressed in an apron for the purpose, and assisted by one or two women, ladled the gruel at meal times, of which composition each boy had one porringer, and no more, except on festive occasions, and then he had 2 ounces and a quarter of bread besides. The bowls never wanted washing. The bowls polished them with their spoons till they shone again, and when they had performed this operation, which never took very long, the spoons being nearly as large as the bowls, they would sit staring at the copper with such eager eyes as if they could have devoured the very bricks of which it was composed, employing themselves, meanwhile, in sucking their fingers most assiduously with the view of catching up any stray splashes of gruel that might have been cast thereon. Boys have generally excellent appetites. Oliver Twist and his companions suffered the tortures of slow starvation for 3 months. At least they got so voracious and wild with hunger that one boy, who was tall for his age and hasn't been used to that sort of thing, for his father had kept a small cookshop, hinted darkly to his companions that unless he had another basin of gruel per diem, he was afraid he might some night happen to eat the boy who slept next him. Cannibal, who happened to be a weakly youth of tender age. Cannibal. He had a wild, hungry-eyed cannibal, and they implicitly believed him. A council was held, lots were cast who should wake up to the master after supper that evening and ask for more. And it fell to poor Oliver Twist. The evening arrived, the boys took their places. The master, in his cook's uniform, stationed himself at the copper. His pauper assistants ranged themselves behind him. The gruel was served out, and a long grace was said over the short commons. The gruel disappeared, the boys whispered each other and winked at Oliver. Save us from the cannibal, please help us. While his next neighbours nudged him. Child as he was desperate with hunger and reckless with misery. He rose from the table and advancing to the master, basin and spoon in hand, said somewhat alarmed at his own temerity, "Please, sir, I want some more." The master was a fat, healthy man, but he turned very pale. He gazed in stupefied astonishment for the small rebel for some seconds, and clung for support to the copper. The assistants were paralyzed with wonder, the boys with fear. "What?" said the master at length in a faint voice. "Please, sir," replied Oliver, "I want some more." The master aimed a blow at Oliver's head with the ladle, pinning him in his arms, and shrieked aloud for the beadle. The board was sitting in solemn conclave when Mr. Bumble rushed into the room in great excitement and addressing the gentleman in the high chair. "Mr. Limbkins, I beg your pardon, sir. Oliver Twist has asked for more." There was a general start. Horror was depicted on every countenance.
"For more?"
said Mr. Limbkins.
"Compose yourself, Bumble, and answer me distinctly. Do I understand that he asked for more after he had eaten the supper allotted for the dietary?"
"He did, sir," replied Bumble.
"That boy will be hung,"
said the gentleman in the white waistcoat.
"I know that boy will be hung."
Olden times, man. Ask for more food, you get hung. Nobody controverted the prophetic gentleman's opinion. An animated discussion took place. Oliver was ordered into instant confinement, and a bill was next morning pasted on the outside of the gate, offering a reward of £5 to anybody who would take Oliver Twist off the hands of the parish. In other words, £5 and Oliver Twist were offered to any man or woman who wanted an apprentice to any trade, business, or calling. Oliver Twist, wow, that poor thing.